Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first lecture of this course, The Governing Principles of Ancient China. Now, as you know from the introduction video, the book of Governing Principles is a compilation of all of the past teachings on how to govern a country, which extracts the best teachings from 14,000 books and 89,000 scrolls of ancient writings dating back from the era of the 5 legendary emperors to the Jin dynasty, which is from the 21st century BC to 420 AD. Okay, so quite a long time. Now, in order to assist modern learners to learn about the governing principles and also to apply the ancient philosophies in modern governance, we reorganized the content by 9 major topics. So, in this lecture, we'll study the first topic, namely ethical governance based on education. Okay, ethical governance based on education. Now, there are 2 significances about this title of the first lecture. The first significance is the word ethical. Now, as you will see repeatedly in this course, the core of governance is in fact ethics. Okay, and we can interpret this in two ways. One is that the ultimate goal of governance is to make the society an ethical society. Right? So this is about the elevation of human development along the line of ethics. You see, a society that is economically prosperous but ethically inferior is not a successful society. In fact, it is a society full of competition and pain. So ethics is the ultimate goal of governance. And meanwhile, ethics is also about the conduct and moral standard of the governing body itself. A government that uses ethics as a guideline to manage its business will be more successful and efficient than a government that disregards ethical conduct. Okay? So ethics is the first significance of this title. And we talk about this in lecture 1 because ethical governance is the core of the governing principles of ancient China. Now, the second significance of this title is education. Education. In traditional Chinese culture, education is not only a governmental department, but it is also the ultimate tool of governing itself. Now, in many occasions of this course, you will see that as compared to, let's say, regulation and law, education, in particular, ethical education is used to reduce crime, to correct social value, to achieve solidarity among the people, to increase government efficiency, and finally, to achieve world peace. So, in traditional Chinese culture, education focuses much more on the ethical side of human life. Okay, education is not only about obtaining a graduation certificate for future career purpose, but also about maintaining a mentally rich life or life standard, right? Mentally rich life standard. But you see, this is not unique to the Chinese culture, right? I mean, in all human societies, we find that ethical education is the only way to elevate human life standard and promote social harmony. So the teaching of the traditional Chinese culture is not only useful to the Chinese, but also to the rest of the world, regardless of the cultural background and the chosen political structure. Now, having a good understanding of the 2 fundamental concepts of governance, we'll formally begin lecture 1. Okay. Now, the first thing we want to ask is that if there is one thing that we focus on in order to achieve good governance, then what is it? Is it political structure? Is it certain economic theory, neoclassical or Keynesian or neoliberalism? Or is it the individuals of the governing body? Well, the governing principle put much more emphasis on the person running the government. The person running the government, rather than the chosen structure itself. In other words, the structure can be improved or not improved. But if the person isn't right, a structure can be exploited to hurt the interest of the people. Now, this is such an important point that I think it warrants a lot more explanation. Okay. Now, there are many ways, right? There are many ways to elaborate the importance of the person in charge. But I guess the easiest way is to examine the cause of corruption, because corruption is generally about human behavior. Also, we can say that among all government failure, corruption is the most damaging behavior because it impairs all of the positive effort of governmental work. So, what is corruption anyway? Well, corruption can be defined as dishonest or fraudulent conduct by those in power. So, from here, there are 3 points about corruption. Okay, 3 points. In other words, 3 conditions of corruption. They are selfish thought or personal desire. Okay, the same thing. And second is the power of a person. And the third is insufficient oversight. Okay, 3 conditions. Now, let's examine these conditions in more detail. We can largely divide the condition into 2 groups, right? These 3 conditions into 2 groups, which are how to corrupt and why corrupt. Okay, how and why. Now, power and authority is a condition that enables someone to corrupt, right? It involves personal network and resources, etc. But the question is power definitely going to lead to the action of corruption? Well, not necessarily. We know a lot of powerful government leaders or officials, but not all of them corrupt. And quite the contrary, they use their power to promote economic prosperity and social harmony. So power is only a necessary condition of corruption, but not a sufficient condition. Power itself is actually neutral, isn't it? I mean, it is the person that matters. So power can be used to benefit the people or to destroy social order. Now, what about oversight? Well, someone may say that, no matter how powerful a person is, as long as we design a better oversight system and block all the loopholes, then there will be no corruption. Well, this may be right. And in fact, this is what many regulators have been working extremely hard on. But let me give you an example. And I'm going to use an example from a corporate governance study. Okay? Corporate governance is the study that examines mechanisms that align interests between the corporate managers and the shareholders, and also to monitor managerial behavior. Now, in doing so, corporations invented what is called performance-linked equity compensation for the top executives. Now, in particular, companies issue share options to executives, which only vest in a few years' time. And after that, the executives can exercise the option. Okay. Now, since the exercise price of the option is set at a value that is equal to the share price at the time the options are issued, so if the value of the company increases during the vesting period, then the executives will make an immediate profit by exercising the options. Okay, so the idea is to give the executives an incentive to work hard to maximize the company's value. Okay, it's a very simple setup. However, in recent years, we find that the executives backdate the options. What does that mean? Well, it means that after the options have been issued, they change the issue date of the option so that a profit upon exercising the option is almost guaranteed. Well, this completely eliminates the incentive effect of stock options, right? Well, although, performance-linked compensation is not strictly an oversight mechanism, but an incentive mechanism, it is a very good mechanism that makes the executives self-discipline. However, our example illustrates that a good system can be played, right? Can be, twisted, which leads to a corruption-like behavior. The better the system, the more clever the anti-oversight behavior. Now, it's a bit like a martial art competition. No matter how clever the attack, there's always a way to intercept the attack and counterattack. Okay, so as an external condition, incomplete oversight is also not a sufficient condition of corruption. So in our discussion so far about the above two factors of corruption, now one thing in common is that the person must have the intention to corrupt in the first place, right? Without the intention or willingness to corrupt, corruption simply won't happen. So this is what we call the internal condition of corruption. Now, the intention can come from, a certain selfish mentality and uncontrolled desire. If desire is under control and morality is maintained, even under loose supervision and with great power, the person simply does not corrupt. So, we can now say something about the relative importance among the three factors of corruption. It is quite clear that the internal factor is more fundamental than the external factors. Now, we're not saying that they're not important, but on a relative basis, you see, the internal factor is the key. It is the final line of defense. So from here, we can also say that the leader's moral compass and a sense of responsibility is very important to successful governance. More important than the structure of the government and the power given to the leader. Now, sometimes it is easier, to talk about regulation than personal cultivation of the leader. Also, much more effort has been put into the improvement of government structure and the oversight mechanism. And we rarely hear anything about the improvement of ethical standard of the leaders. So I think we must go further to understand why ethics is important. Why can't we simply rely on regulation and oversight? Now, to do this, we'll now turn our attention to the teaching of the governing principles of ancient China. Okay, now, firstly, let's have a look at the relationship between the leader and regulation or law. Okay, leader, regulation. Okay, so first of all, what is law? Well, law is the method with which justice is maintained. Okay, so it is the method of justice. At any point in time, it is fixed. It is without life, is lifeless, right? Meanwhile, the leader is the operator of law. Without the leader, law doesn't do anything. The leader applies his intelligence or her intelligence to use the law to achieve certain purpose, right? And it can be promoting social equality, deterring bad monopolistic behavior, or it could be used to appropriate public interest. Now, it's like the relationship between the car and the driver. It is the driver who makes the decision of driving in a safe or dangerous manner, not the car, right? Not even Tesla, I guess, right? Now, in Book 38, or we call it Volume 38 of the Governing Principles of Ancient China, Xunzi makes it very clear that there is the leader who leads the country into chaos, but no such law that leads the country into demise. Now, I would like to read this paragraph for you. It says that there are no such things as chaotic countries, but just countries with corrupted rulers. There are no such thing as efficient policies that can keep a country safe and peaceful without the wise rulership of worthy people. Thus, a virtuous leader is eager to find a superior man who can help him to govern well, while an unwise leader is only eager to gain power. With a superior man serving in his administration, the ruler is able to relax and enjoy a peaceful and orderly country. He would also gain great reputation for being a good leader. On the other hand, a ruler who is eager to gain power will exhaust his energy and throw the country into chaos. Not only will he jeopardize his career, but also bring disgrace to himself. So, the laws of governance provide the basis, you see, while men of noble character put them into practice, right? Without them, not even well-designed laws can prevent social upheavals. For example, at the beginning of the Xia dynasty, okay, the country was ruled by Emperor Yu, who was a benevolent king. He treated the people as his own children. But towards the end of the Xia dynasty, the ruling class threw away their ethical standard. I mean, the law was still there, it was still the same law, but the dynasty ended and the ruling body was overthrown by the people. The Shang dynasty, or let's say the Shang family, took over and established the Shang dynasty. Okay, and Shang Tang was the first king, and he was also a very benevolent king. His virtues spread all over the empire, and the country was governed at the highest moral standard. Again, towards the end of the dynasty, the unvirtuous King Zhou got his head cut off by the angry people in a revolution. And King Zhou took no advice from the loyal ministers and only indulged in luxurious life. Same story, same government structure, same law, and yet very different fate. Okay, so the morality of the leader is, I would say, an important part that determines the fate of the country. Now, this also has certain implication on the government recruitment of the officials. Okay, a leader should make sure that the officials are morally superior, so that he doesn't play with the law. Now, we'll come back to the selection criteria of government officials later during this course, because this is a significant part of the teachings of the governing principles. Now, we've been saying that the leader's morality is crucial to the fate of the government and certainly the tendency of corruption. But look, by no means do we undermine the importance of law and regulation. Right? We emphasize on ethics, but it's not the same as moral idealism. Right? We still need the regulation to protect ethics. In particular, it protects the outcome of ethical education. If there is no regulation, ethics cannot function with a strong guarantee. For example, in finance, ethics means taking responsibility in managing the client's money, among other things, of course. And as a money manager, right, you need to inform the investors about the risk of the market and educate the investors about the problem of irrational trading and over risk taking, etc. And this is in the spirit of righteousness. But if there is no financial regulation, many fund managers will mislead investors and make a lot of commission income by introducing inappropriate financial products to investors. Now, if you don't do the same, then you may be fired by your own investment company simply because everybody else is doing it. So not only is your ethical superiority ignored by other industry practitioners, but may also hinder your own career. So under this pressure, it becomes extremely difficult for you to maintain a high level of morality. So the protection function of law on ethics is very, very important. And of course, ethics supports the spirit of law and regulation. Another difference between ethics and regulation is that they function differently. Although both deter crime, right, they work differently in terms of the timing. Ethics prevents crime before it takes place. Right? This is because people are bounded by moral compass and the sense of justice. But law and regulation largely punish crime after it is committed. Right? It deters crime largely by sending an alert to the public with the punishment. Now, what's the best scenario? Well, I guess it is where the provision of the punishment exists, but it never has to be used because people are self-disciplined, and that comes from effective moral education and human development. So, all in all, I think it is fair to say that ethics is the root of governance, right? Ethics is the root of governance. And when it comes to eradicating corruption, ethics deals with the root cause of corruption, with the teaching of righteousness, sense of responsibility, and the sense of justice. Law, on the other hand, unifies actions. Right? Different people may have different opinions about things, so law makes it easier to manage by laying down a unified guidance, the do's and don'ts for people to follow. Now, having understood the relationship between ethics and law, we can now explain why ethics should be given the priority. Okay, why? Well, this is simply because a good regulation can only be made by people who are ethically superior. The governing principle indicates that a sage ruler would never wage a personal vendetta at the expense of public justice when making law and regulation. So when he is making the law, it is only about justice, and it is not for the purpose of protecting his own interest group. Now, a deeper meaning is that the only benchmark of lawmaking should be ethics. And more specifically, the benchmark is benevolence and righteousness. In fact, benevolence and righteousness are much closer to practical lawmaking than you might think. For example, when lawmakers make financial regulations, sometimes there is pressure from certain interest groups to deregulate the financial market, right? A financial deregulation allows for a wider scope of business making by financial service companies and potentially higher profit. for the consumers, there may be better access to certain financial products. But when benevolence and righteousness come into play, there are more to consider. Okay, a benevolent financial regulation takes into account of the dark side of human habit, such as uncontrolled desire of making quick money, or things like that. And this leads to deceitful financial conduct, misleading information to clients, and sometimes simply cheating. And this became very obvious when thousands of pensioners lost their lifetime saving during the financial crisis because they bought into toxic financial product based on misrepresented risk information. So we're not saying that financial deregulation would always lead to such results, but we can certainly say that deregulation didn't take into account of all the potential human flaws, and the only consideration of deregulation was profitability. Another implication about ethics in lawmaking is that law and regulation must be easily understood. Now, this sounds obvious, but from an ethical perspective, confusing regulation can lead the society into chaos. Apparently, it is not the intention of lawmakers to confuse people on purpose, right? But sometimes they are reluctant to make unambiguous regulations. For example, during the pandemic, in the year 2020, people sometimes find that the government gives confusing signals about social distancing. On the one hand, it seems that the government wants to maintain the level of social autonomy and avoid to be viewed as a tough government. But on the other hand, the rising number of infection and death put increasing pressure on a stricter social distancing rule. So what should the government do? Right? What is the priority in this scenario? Should the government continue this ambiguity and maintain a rather liberal image, or should the government issue very clear social distancing rule until the infection rate drops significantly? Well, you see, righteousness and benevolence, they do not mean that the government will never get blamed by the general public. But this consideration does direct the government to think more carefully about what is the right thing to do for the people. It is very similar to a situation where, parents have to make a tough decision for the children, which may not be welcomed by the children in the short term, but can prove beneficial in the long term. And of course, ethics is not only relevant to lawmaking, but also governance in general, right? The governing principles emphasize that when forming the government cabinet, for example, ethics and virtue should drive the selection of the candidates. But more importantly, the leader must be virtuous himself or herself, so that he will attract equally virtuous and able candidates. The virtuous candidates are not only attracted by financial reward, but also by a high level of ethical superiority of the leader. Now, very interestingly, the Scottish philosopher Alistair MacIntyre pointed out that no matter how perfect or detailed the ethical principles are, if people do not possess the necessary ethical traits and virtue, then these principles simply will not work. He said, no matter how close the relationship is between virtue and law, with respect to the utility or application of law, it only functions well for those who are righteous. So this means that a fair governing system can only be designed by a virtuous person, and only a virtuous person can implement the system properly. And from a human resource perspective, a leader must be supported by virtuous subordinates. Okay. The next question, in order, I think, is how do we promote ethics in the entire system of governance? How do we promote it? Now, as we mentioned in the introduction of this course, education is the ultimate tool to bring ethics into governance, and the core of education is morality. Now, this may sound obvious, but in reality, oftentimes we emphasize a lot on the knowledge acquisition side of education, but give very little weight on morality. Taking financial education as an example, okay, if we look at the curriculum of undergraduate and postgraduate accounting and finance programs in the university, financial ethics takes no more than 5% of the syllabus. This is not a coincidence, as we witness increasingly frequent financial misconduct and crisis in the last few decades. For example, we all know the Enron accounting scandal, right, which took place in 2001. Now, we don't want to get into too much details about it here, but what we can say is that the company and certain energy traders put profitability way ahead of people's lives and the safety of their investment. The Enron case was known by almost everybody, right, and taken as a case study of unethical financial conduct. However, the biggest financial crisis that shocked the world took place in 2007, and the root can be traced a few years earlier. Just look at how close these two cases were, only 6 years apart. Only 6 years apart. Now, although, the underlying assets were different, the principle of the crisis was exactly the same. So this makes me wonder, how could nobody remember the market tragedy just took place only 6 years ago and let it happen again? Well, this is because our focus didn't change, right? And that is profit making. You see, we must understand that making profit is not wrong. It's what a person should be doing in order to provide for his family. But what we did do wrong was that we didn't understand the cause of profit. Where does profit come from? The Book of Rights outlined the process of making money from the leader's perspective. It says that first, one must have high standard of morality. With a high standard of morality, virtuous people, which is human capital, will come to join the leader, and thereby physical capital can be produced. For a country, this means that the territory is secured and stable. Now, for a company, this could mean intellectual capital, knowledge and research and innovation, etc. These are physical capital or intangible and productive capital. Okay. Now, with these capital, things will be produced. Not just normal things, but useful and value-adding products. We call that wealth creation. With wealth creation, people can finally put them into good use and thereby raising the standard of living. So you can see that, profit-making and wealth come very late during the process. And the root cause of wealth is, in fact, ethics. The financial crisis demonstrates very clearly that without ethics, previously created wealth will be eliminated. So in the long term, there is very little gain. And this is why traditional education takes morality teaching as its core, because it has practical meaning. The governing principles recorded an interesting conversation between the King Hui of Liang and Mencius. Okay, Mencius was the advisor to the king for a period of time. The king once asked Mencius, "How do you propose to bring profit to our country?" Instead of giving the king a straight answer of profit-making, Mencius rejected the idea and said, "You shouldn't be talking about profit-making as a king, sir." Well, why? Because if the king talks about profit only, then the ministers and the rest of the government will gradually be profit-driven, and so will be the people in general. This certainly leads to a widespread of competitive mentality. Now, if everybody in the country is fighting for their own interest, the country will be in a place of danger. So this demonstrates, again, the ideal sequence of governance. Moral education should come first. Okay? Now, you may wonder, okay, how about law? What about law, regulation? Can we solve ethical problem or social problem and financial misconduct simply by creating more stringent law and regulation? Can we do that? Well, yes, of course we can. I mean, we should. Remember, the governing principles say that we need law and regulation to protect ethics. But the sequence still matters. If we put law above ethical education, we're likely to face certain unintended consequences, and by unintended we mean negative consequence. The first potential problem is a change in people's mentality, and that is shamelessness in avoiding punishment. The Analects say that if people are only led by law and unified by punishment, they will try to avoid the punishment and feel no shame about it. In other words, they may feel very clever and proud for successfully dodging the law or punishment. But if people are led by virtue and moral education and unified by the rule of propriety, or we call it the rule of rights, then they will have the sense of shame and be willing to act in an ethical way. Rights and proprieties are not law, but a set of code of social conduct that are in line with human nature and harmony. Now, this is not something created out of vacuum. This is proved experience. With more law being created, we may find more people engaging in finding loopholes and and avoiding regulation, and inevitably being very proud about it. The problem with this is that it opens the door to potentially more severe crime. And also, drafting and amending the law takes a lot of time, and much of the effort is made to counter these creative law dodgers, right? And by the time new law is drafted, new loopholes may be found. So that's the first potential problem. The second consequence is about what the law cannot do. What the law cannot do. For example, as documented by the governing principles, we know that law can punish an unfilial son. In ancient China, there was specific law that punished people who are unfilial to their parents, such as not fulfilling their responsibilities as a child, not supporting their parents, etc. And this was driven by the overall pursuit of filial piety, which is the core of traditional Chinese culture. However, the governing principles raise the question that whether or not law can produce filial piety in people's heart. Well, as you can imagine, the answer is quite negative, right? Maybe, some unfilial people regret about their conduct and are willing to do good, but law and regulation themselves do not directly lead to an improvement of morality, but only deter crime and bad behavior through punishment. The same goes to punishing the act of the theft. As the principle points out, law may stop theft and make stealing more difficult. It doesn't produce the heart of integrity. So this is why, as we said in the first consequence on the previous page, people may only respond to new law by looking for new loopholes. So that's the second consequence. The third problem with governance being, heavily reliant on law and punishment is that it simply leads to mounting complaint and anger of the people. Now, it doesn't mean that law is redundant. As we said earlier, law is needed to protect ethics and order. However, people may not know, why they break the law or the purpose of the law. So this way, as the cases of punishment increase, anger is accumulated, leading to social unrest. So when we look at social problems, we should think about the root cause. The Governing Principles, Volume 16, say that, that when a country is governed through propriety and righteousness, righteousness is accumulated among the people. When it is governed only through punishment, then it is punishment that is accumulated. With accumulated righteousness, people will learn to live harmoniously with each other. But with accumulated punishment, the social atmosphere will become pessimistic and angry. Anger and complaints only lead to more crime instead of fewer crime. In the Analects, Confucius put this point more directly and said, punishment without education first can be called cruelty. So we can see that Confucius doesn't advocate for a punishment-free governance, which is not realistic anyway. But he calls for a proper examination of the condition of punishment. Punishment is only allowed when people at large have been given appropriate moral education. Right? Of course, the process of education is another complex issue on which the governing principles have provided a very rich guidance. But generally speaking, with moral education in place, the number of crimes should drop because people are more self-restrained and self-disciplined. After that, if there are still cases of resistance and education cannot solve it, then punishment is used as the last resort. When education is implemented effectively and properly, even with relatively loose regulation, governance and social morality will still thrive. This is because social morality is based on education, not punishment. And this was, indeed the case of Han Dynasty, where Confucian education was implemented from the royal family and the government down to the common people. So anyway, that was the third consequence. The fourth consequence is about the very purpose of law itself. The purpose of law itself. Now, in particular, it says that when moral education is inadequate, it undermines the effectiveness of the law. Now, as we quoted earlier, the good principles set out by the law can only be practiced properly by people with virtue. Otherwise, law will be misused or manipulated. So this bears the question, whose justice is the justice system if individual moral cultivation is ignored? Right? In corporate finance research, there are lots of evidence showing that sometimes corporate governance mechanisms may simply become the tool of corporate executives to maximize their own interest. Now, if the moral cultivation of corporate executives is ignored in the recruitment process, then the governance committees may well be under the influence of managerial power. One implication of the design of the law and punishment is that it should be for preventative purpose. Now, it is to deter people from breaking the law. The best case scenario is that the punishment will never have to be used at all. It is like an emergency infirmary service, where the hope is that it never has to be used, right? So to achieve this, it is certainly a must to give moral education considerable weight. If moral education is inadequate, then the preventative purpose will surely be undermined and the punishment will be used. Now, we have talked about, a lot about the interaction and relationship between moral education and law and regulation. And we have shown you why education is more important than the law. So what is the core principle that directs our theoretical deduction and summarize our investigation then? Well, the core principle is that the society is a reflection of the mind of the people, isn't it? The society is a reflection of the mind of the people. So, but to put it differently, people's mindset and or mentality determines their action, and their action leads to a certain social outcome. So this means that the question of whether or not we can achieve social harmony ultimately depends on the mindset of the people. When people's minds are, along the direction of benevolence and righteousness, the society will not be very far from harmony. Very interestingly, the American judge in the 20th century, Learned Hand, shared a very similar view about the relative importance between people's moral compass and law. He said, "I often wonder whether we do not rest our hopes too much upon constitutions, upon laws, and upon courts. These are false hopes. Believe me, these are false hopes. Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can save it. No constitution, no law, no court can even do much to help it." What is this liberty that must lie in the hearts of men and women? It is not the ruthless, the unbridled will. It is not the freedom to do as one likes. So this means that if people, has given up morality and the leader throws away ethics for private gain, then the system of law will eventually become the tool that protects the interest group. Now, this sounds like a complicated problem, but just like, for all problems, there is always the root of it, right? Always a root of the problem. The governing principle emphasizes that the ultimate solution to achieve effective governance and social harmony is to have the leader to demonstrate benevolence first, right? The leader demonstrate first. He must lead the way and show people what a righteous man does. Now, this doesn't mean that he must do everything that the people ask for, in much the same way that the parents don't always satisfy the children's wish. He must decide what is the right thing to do for the people based on the right principle, based on morality, and based on ethics, and based on righteousness, because this is the responsibility of the leader. So only this way, given time, people will understand him, follow him, and support him. And given time, the society will gradually start to focus more on morality and eventually achieve stability. Now, in the second part of the lecture, we'll tackle the other fundamental issue of governance, which is education. And we'll learn about what it really means by sage's education by examining 4 different characteristics. And they are clarity of objective, simplicity, logical and consequential, and finally, being protected by regulation. Okay, so 4 characteristics of sage's education. So first of all, let's have a look at the first one, the clarity of objective. Now, in ancient China, the ethical education is attached with great importance at the level of national governance. There were many schools that were, operated at village and city level, which pupil must attend before entering the national universities. And there were also private education, which was usually received at family level before formal school education. Education has long been recognized as the fundamental tool to elevate human development and the government. So it has been given the highest priority in the system of governance in ancient China. Well, in fact, as stated in the governing principles, it is the primary object when a state or dynasty is established. Now, we know that there has been many dynasties in the Chinese history, right? A dynasty usually ended with a ruthless king who was overthrown by the people and war. And when a new dynasty was established, oftentimes it took only a few years before social stability was reclaimed and economic development was realized. Now, what's the reason for that? Well, the fundamental reason is the use of ethical education. Now, we'll come back to the mechanism of education in a minute, but first, we want to give you an overarching statement of education. What is education? Well, the governing principle says that education or teaching in general should be directed to develop that in which the pupil excels and correct the defect to which he is prone. Now, this is in fact the formal definition about education given by the traditional Chinese teaching. So when we are teaching, we have to think about what is it, that the child should keep doing. So, for example, respect, that's good, being filial, creativity, perseverance, honesty, etc. Okay, so these qualities should not be ignored or taken as given. They must be encouraged. They must be nurtured. They don't just stay there forever. They have to be nurtured. Well, why not? Well, think about the quality of honesty. Okay, the quality of honesty. Now, if the general social atmosphere is one of dishonesty, then the child may be influenced by the people around him or her, and may see honesty not as a virtue, but as a disadvantage. So generally, he will abandon his good quality and embrace the other side, dishonesty. If you think about this problem, this is actually not uncommon, right? A child started off with a lot of good virtues, but 10 years later, when we meet again, we may be looking at a different person. Now, if this happens at a social level, then it is the future of the country at stake, not just the individual person. So these qualities must be identified and then protected. Okay, so that is the first component of education. The second component of education is about correction. Correct what? Well, correct the characters that may one day bring problem to the child. For example, disrespecting the parents, laziness, selfishness, etc. Well, what is the problem with disrespecting the parents? Well, if the child never learns to respect the parents, then there is no reason to expect him to respect other members of the society, such as, classmates and colleagues at work, right? If anything, this would only add unnecessary obstacles to his life in the future. And this problem would become clearer as he grows older and can no longer be protected by his parents' tolerance. There is a Chinese proverb that says, learning is like traveling against the current. without moving forward, the only way is back. So this means that if one doesn't learn, he doesn't just stay put. He doesn't just stay there. He goes back, and he becomes worse. So this is mostly driven by the general social atmosphere and external influence and internal habit. So this is why correction of defect is of long-term thinking. Now, having understood, the two components of education, we should now go one step further and understand the ultimate social purpose of education. Remember, education is not just about individual, but on a national level. Now, if it's on a national level, then a good education would eventually elevate to the overall human development. In the Book of Rites, the chapter of the Great Learning, it says that the way of great learning is to brighten the brilliant virtue, to renovate the people, and to rest in the highest excellence. At the beginning, the focus of education is more about self-enlightenment. And it strives to make the individual understand virtue and guides the people to practice virtue and to achieve higher wisdom. After that, those who have achieved some level of virtue help other people to elevate their moral practice. And when self-enlightenment and enlightening others are perfectly achieved, the society is rest in the highest excellence. Now, because of time constraint, we cannot go into too much detail about this process, but we can see that education is it has very clear objective. It is social harmony, and it starts from personal cultivation. This is the purpose of education in the past. But then, if you ask me, which is more advanced, modern education or ancient education? Well, I would say it is the ancient. You see, the strength of modern education is more about the advancement of technology and acquisition of knowledge. But if not used properly, the same technology that saves life can lead to self-destruction. The Chinese education emphasizes that human beings are pure and good to begin with. But it is the habit that makes them apart. And some of these habits can be quite troublesome, such as inappropriate desire and greed. So the purpose of education is to return people back to the original goodness. Now, the second character of moral education is simplicity. Now, although the process of moral education is complex, we can, however, classify moral education into two different ways. One is the scope where moral education operates, and the other is the subject. Now, in terms of the scope, we first focus on the so-called five human relations. The five human relations. Now, this refers to our interpersonal relationships. And it begins with a natural love between parents and children. And, the natural love between parents and children is natural love, is unconditional love, is true love, right? It is the bond between parents and children. And also, there is, the second relation is there are separate responsibilities between a husband and wife. Now, separate refers to different roles. Different physiologies have different roles. The husband bears the responsibility outside of the household. He provides for the family's living income, and the wife controls inside the household. And her most important responsibility is to educate the children to be saints, sages, and men and women of noble character. And that's the wife's role. But look, that doesn't mean that it is only the wife's responsibility to educate the child. We're talking about the natural advantage of female. Mother is the first teacher of a child, right? And the child learns very naturally from the mother. So this early learning has a profound impact on the child's personal character. So that's why there is the separate responsibility. The third one says that there is loyalty and caring between leaders and subordinates. This is about honoring each other, basically. Okay, leaders and those who are being led need to morally support each other. Now, we'll spend a lot of time explaining the relationship between leaders and subordinates in this course. Okay, in future lectures. Also, there is order between senior and junior. There is trust among friends. Okay, so these 5 relationships are called the 5 moral relationships. Okay, or human relationships, and they encompass all interpersonal relationships. Well, I mean, I suppose everybody born on this planet, okay, in one way or another, will experience relationships such as parent and children, husband and wives, leaders and subordinates, juniors and seniors, and as friends. Okay, and these 5 relationships cannot be transcended. There is no individual who can be excluded from them. And these 5 relationships represent the natural order. This order is part of the nature and is not man-made. Is not determined by anyone. It is the natural order that is self-regulated. The action, therefore, the action of aligning, oneself with this order is called practicing the way, or in Chinese we call it the Tao, practicing the Tao, practicing the natural way. So we know that nobody is, no man is an island, and so how do we maintain a good human relation? Well, this requires a secret catalyst, and that is called virtue. Okay, virtue refers to how we should act and follow the natural order of things as we engage in the 5 human relation, and this is the subject of education. Okay. Now, throughout the long history of China, the great scholars and sages, kings and officials have summarized a number of related versions of virtues. For example, there is what is called the 5 moral constants, namely benevolence, righteousness, propriety, wisdom, and trust. Okay, and they're called moral constant because they are the standard of being a person. When these standards are followed, social order is maintained, and the 5 human relations are in harmony. When they are abandoned, the human relations deteriorate. Why is that? Well, it is because the 5 moral constants are not made up rules but they're natural. And it comes from, the innate goodness of people. Okay, now let's briefly explain the 5 moral constants. Okay? First of all, benevolence. In Chinese language, benevolence means 2 persons. Okay, and it means that when one thinks about oneself, he or she also thinks about others. And it also means that if things that one doesn't want to do, one doesn't ask others to do. So this is called benevolence, because you think about other people, right? Now, if benevolence is practiced, then people will naturally forgive, wouldn't they? Because, you want to be forgiven. Because that nobody is perfect, because we're not perfect. Now, when we say we love ourselves, well, what does that really mean? Well, a person who truly loves himself or herself is one who doesn't let go of his inner goodness. He doesn't let go. He wants to protect that inner goodness. And benevolence is the first and foremost. Only when a person truly loves himself, he knows how to love other people. But if he doesn't love other people, then he doesn't really love himself. The second quality is righteousness, and it means the following the right principle, or doing the right thing in a rational manner. Now, this covers a lot of things, such as legal, illegal issue, dealing with people at work, dealing with family relations, etc. So righteousness is a function that supports benevolence. Is more about, the way things are done. For example, in dealing with criminals using law and punishment, righteousness could mean that the level of punishment is minimized as much as possible as long as it serves the purpose of deterring crime and awakening the heart of regret of the offenders. Punishment is not an enjoyable thing. It's not enjoyment of those who execute the law, right? And benevolence is also used in this scenario, and righteousness is the action. So lawmakers punish the offender. If lawmakers punish the offenders with joy, then it is not righteousness, and it may cause further retaliation. So righteousness can also take the form of respect, right? Because respect is the proper thing to do. For example, the student respecting the teacher is righteousness. But let me ask you, by the way, why should the students respect the teachers? Well, because teachers enable the student to achieve moral improvement and obtain the tools to make a better living. When the teachers are given proper respect, they're more motivated to fulfill their responsibilities to teach. And this forms a nice ecosystem. Now, unfortunately, these days, teachers are treated as a service provider, and students are treated as customers who pay for the service. In universities, especially, there's a very little respect. And to be frank, as a university teacher myself, I can tell you, sometimes the relationship between the student and the teacher is as cold as ice. The problem with that icy cold relationship is that the teachers are not motivated to give 100%. Look, we must understand that education is not the same as an MOT test or fixing a refrigerator. You don't do it by the manual. It needs the teacher's heart. It's personal. So without respect, the teacher is simply unable to give 100%, but only keep to the minimum effort. And this is the loss caused by the lacking of righteousness. Righteousness also has huge implication in business conduct, especially in the area where there is insufficient regulation. For example, the financial crisis is a result of total disregard of righteousness. Now, moving on, as compared to righteousness, propriety or rights is more about the concrete code of conduct. Okay, and it's more visible than righteousness. Oftentimes, we see a fairly detailed written codes or regulations. For example, the dress code, right? The dress code for a funeral. That is propriety, isn't it? It's not law, but it is certain things that we do with cautious. Why cautious? Because it has certain social implication. According to Confucianism, propriety is about showing the highest respect. Again, this respect is not by force, but out of our innate nature. Propriety is the external representation of inner goodness, and it also helps to nurture this innate goodness. For example, when you see people standing in solemnness in a funeral or ancestral remembrance ceremony, automatically you will feel the sense of respect as well, right? This is not only the respect paid to those who have passed away, but also it makes the mind more humble and kind. So propriety is definitely not for the sake of formality, but it has real social impact. And learning about propriety is not to control our freedom or behavior, but to harness our inner goodness. And in turn, the elevation of people's inner goodness raises the overall level of comfort of the society, and that is beneficial to everybody. The fourth one, wisdom. Wisdom can be interpreted as rationality. You see, when people lose rationality and let emotion take control, people usually misinterpret what they see and mistaken good with bad, right with wrong. And this will lead to all sorts of problems and social chaos. Finally, trust. And trust means responsibility and trustworthiness. Confucius once said, without trustworthiness, there is no standing in the society for a person. And I think this remark explained itself quite well. Trust is important, but it also means the confidence in morality, and we must trust morality. Now, you must have noticed that there is a sequence, right? There's a sequence among these 5 moral constants, with benevolence in the first place and trust in the last. So what does this mean? Well, it means that trusting morality is the bottom line. Okay, let me repeat this. Trusting morality is the bottom line. Why? Well, when benevolence is lost, there is still, righteousness to provide guidance about what is right and what is wrong. If you have watched the Star Wars spin-off series, The Mandalorian, righteousness, in fact, plays a big part in the standing of the race of the Mandalore in the entire galaxy. It is actually, very touching and very true as well. Even though, people may not love each other as much as they did before, they still have this moral code to comply with. So that's why, righteousness in the second place. Now, propriety is in the third place because it emphasizes more on the concrete code of conduct and regulation. Trust is the bottom line because without trust in morality, if we don't trust morality, the traditional teaching will be completely lost, and there is nothing left to save the world from self-destruction. And this doesn't, not only does it apply to the Chinese culture, but also all the great cultures in the world, both religious and non-religious. And this means that to make the world a better place, we need to reclaim our trust in the traditional teachings. That's the only way. But this is not hard because, you see, the 5 moral constants are not man-made. They're parts of our nature, right? We feel it, we trust it, we do it. And if all of us are willing to practice morality bit by bit, the world will be a different place. Now, apart from the 5 moral constants, the governing principle also document what is called the 4 anchors, right? The 4 anchors, and they were, initially raised by Guanzi. And this includes propriety, righteousness, integrity, and shamefulness. A slightly different version of the above is called the 8 virtues, and they are filial piety, fraternal love, loyalty, trust, propriety, righteousness, integrity, and shamefulness. And later on, people summarize the above qualities and virtues as the 12 virtues. Now, we're not going to explain each single one of them, these subjects of education in great length in this particular lecture, but I do want to talk about the interrelation between them. In particular, I want to show you the logical sequence in education, and this leads us to the third character of traditional Chinese education, which is logical and sequential. Now, you may notice that in the 8 virtues, we have filial piety. Okay, filial piety. Now, this is in fact the first step of a person's education. Let me repeat this. This is the first step of a person's education. It's the fundamental step of education. We said that the concept of benevolence is very important, right? But filial piety is the starting point to nurture all of those moral constants. Is where the action is. Now, I would like to read a quote from the book called The Guidance for Being a Good Pupil and Child. Okay, it says, well, this is a book read by all the Chinese as children. So it says, first, it teaches us how to be dutiful to our parents and how to be respectful and loving to our siblings. Then it teaches us how to be cautious with all people, matters, and things in our daily life, and to be a trustworthy person. Furthermore, it teaches us to love all equally, be close to and learn from people of virtue and compassion. When we have accomplished all of the above duties, we can further study and learn literature and art to improve the quality of our cultural and spiritual life. Okay, so that was the paragraph. Now, this paragraph illustrates the important sequence in a child's early education, and it starts with the filiality to the parents, then the loving relationship with other members of the family, and then the rest of the society. You see, the stage of knowledge acquisition doesn't get mentioned until the moral training has reached a certain standard. So knowledge is rather late in the process. Now, you might wonder why this is so. Is it simply because it was the ancient time and the level of technology was not as advanced, so knowledge wasn't very important? Well, first of all, knowledge includes many things, like literature, writing, poet, etc. So it's not just technology. Secondly, without a good foundation of morality and ethics, learning knowledge only learning knowledge, right, increases the child's sense of pride without much benefit. This is in contrast to today's education system. Children these days start, all kinds of learning very early. There is even computer programming for children. I know there's one child, a very smart child. He could do some simple coding on a computer. Very impressive. So one day, he, went back home and showed his work to his grandmother. And of course, the grandmother praised him for his achievement. And then he turned around and asked, "Grandma, can you write this code on a computer?" His grandma said, "Of course not, darling. How am I supposed to know?" And this child said, "Grandma, you are so stupid." Well, I don't know what you think about the situation, but I think the child has a long way to go before reaching the minimum requirement of courtesy, respect, and gratefulness. I mean, clearly there is a problem, right? The problem is not with these subjects and learning itself, but it is the sequence of learning, especially for young children. The governing principles indicate that filial piety is the foundation of all virtues and is the source of all learning. It also says that for a person who wants to be successful and morally superior, filial piety is the fundamental. Well, the big question is why? We haven't talked about why yet, right? Why? Well, the education of filial piety from an early age can produce incredible moral imprint on a person's mind. Moral imprint. Through being dutiful to the parents, the child learns self-control, learns to be grateful, and learns to respect. This is not the same as denying the nature of the child, which is active and innovative, right? It doesn't deny any of that. Morality, self-control, and creativity are not the kind of things that contradict each other. They don't. More importantly, in the long term, filial piety can reduce the tendency of crime and the thinking of, profit over ethics. Why is that? Well, because the thinking of ethics over profit is the manifestation of responsibility and thoughtfulness. You see, for a child who has been trained to be thoughtful about his manner with the parents, his response to the parents and his natural loving relation with the parents will make him think more carefully about things. In the Analects, you can see in the quote, right? In the Analects, Zhong You made it very clear that a person who is filial to the parents and fraternal to siblings are unlikely to disrespect his colleagues and senior at the place of work. This is not because of lacking of imagination, or being a weak person. No, but it's because of thoughtfulness in human relation. And the first place that this thoughtfulness is developed is in the parents-children relation. Now, if we expand this causal relation to a wider society, then we can no longer ignore the significance of filial piety. If the society, overall emphasizes and practices filial piety and fraternal love from early age, then people's mind will be will be well developed, and social harmony can be improved. Now, if we, look at the Chinese writing of filial piety or filiality, we can see why this is such a significant concept and why it has a profound impact on social harmony. The word filiality is in a red box, okay? And as you may recognize, it is consisted of two parts. Can you see? The top part is a variant of the character elderly in the brown box, and the bottom part is the character descendant in the blue box. Okay, so it's the combination of the two with a bit of a variation. So when we put these two things together, what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that the younger generation has a responsibility to take care of the older generation. You can see that they carry the older generation. And that's why these two characters are, arranged as such. They're not arranged side by side, but one at the top and the other at the bottom. But the story doesn't end here, right? At some point, you see, the younger generation becomes the older generation in about 30-something years, and they will be carried and taken care of by their descendants. And this cycle continues. So that's why in a family where filial piety is promoted and practiced, we often see that the parents take care of the grandparents and the children take care of the parents. Right? This is because the children learn from their parents from an early age, and it becomes very natural. So this way, the two generations are one entity. They're interdependent. Now, if we expand this cycle a bit further, we can see a continuous linkage through time, right? And this relation between the older and younger generation can be traced back to the first man ever walked the earth. So this is why the Chinese have always put great emphasis on the concept of ancestors, because we are all one entity, right? So this is the vertical relationship through time, if you like. Now, what about the horizontal relationship? Well, this comes to the application of the concept of oneness, right? Oneness. If we expand oneness to the rest of the society, then we treat all elderlies as our parents and all youngsters as our descendants. This means that we love them all, and this is where the concept of universal love and equality comes in. Interestingly, when Mencius gave advice about governance to King Hui of Liang, as we mentioned earlier, he said, "Treat with the reverence due to age the elders in your own family, so that the elders in the families of others shall be similarly treated." Mencius also said that such affection to one's parents can be transformed to kindness and loving people in general. And the kindness can be further transformed into respecting all living creatures. You see, not just people, but animals and natural environment as well. This is not a fantasy or utopia. This is possible, okay, when human beings are well developed. And the first step to achieve such high level of development starts right from the family, from the first relationship a person would ever have with another person, and that is the parents-children relationship. The last character of moral education in traditional Chinese culture is that the outcome of moral education is protected by regulation. This is similar to the ethics-law relation that we discussed earlier in this lecture. Yeah, but I think it has great significance in today's society. I mean, sometimes people may feel that moral education is nothing more than talking and theory, and it is disconnected from everyday life. Well, unfortunately, this has been made true, but not because morality is unproductive, but because there is no social mechanism to enforce it. Of course, in a perfect world, morality should not have to be enforced. It should be natural. Because we're not living in a perfect world, however, and sometimes taking a moral shortcut seems to lead to immediate benefit. But the downside of the lacking of morality will be felt in the long term, and it can be quite devastating. For example, in a society of dishonesty, people do not trust each other, and it puts tremendous hindrance on business and leads to waste of resources on crafting, business law and all kinds of preventative mechanisms. It also leads to huge market inefficiency. So, because we are living in an imperfect world, the government can draw regulations that target certain ethical conduct and use that to direct people's attention to ethical education. Now, let me give you an example which was used in ancient China. Okay, In fact, this is also in the mind of all modern Chinese as well. The example I will show you is the selection criteria of government officials. When the government recruits officials, okay, one important criteria is the satisfactory performance of two things: filial piety and integrity. This is because a person who is filial can be expected to be loyal, loyal to the country and to the people. The rationale behind this is actually very simple. Now think about this. Let's say if one of your friends helps you with something important, you owe him a favor, and you never forget, right? You'll try to do your friend a favor at the earliest opportunity, and that is reciprocity. That is loyalty. That is how you maintain friendship. But in one's life, who is it that we owe the most? Well, it's our parents. Being a parent is a 24/7 job that doesn't get paid, not to mention the financial support for at least 20-something years of our life. Our parents worry about our health, our relationships, our jobs. And, when we go to a job interview, they're probably more nervous than we are. But they just never show it. They never tell you. So, parents would be the first person to whom we must pay our debt. And we're not talking about, monetary value here, but our heart. So if a person pays no respect to his parents and doesn't take care of his parents when they get old, but he tells you that in a job interview that he will be loyal to your company and your organization, it's just very difficult to assign any credibility to it. So in the ancient times, the government will send investigators to find out about a candidate's filiality through talking to his neighbors, to his families, etc. They will also test the candidate's integrity by secretly presenting expensive gifts or money, and see if he holds up his principles. If all the tests are satisfactory, then the government will select the candidate and fund him to complete further education. Now, although different dynasties had their own variation, this was largely the selection mechanism adopted in ancient China. And you can see that those great officials who made huge contribution to the country governance, without exception, all excelled in fulfilling their filial duty. So filial piety is not only a topic in ethical education, but it is promoted through government selection process or procedure. It becomes part of the regulation, and certainly this encourages the society to give considerable attention to filial piety and children education. But of course, time has changed, and I think it would be nearly impossible for the employers to find out about this sort of information of filial piety. But still, we can think of a way to formally address a person's filial character. So this type of selection system takes morality into account, and it has two functions. Okay, two functions. First, it emphasizes the aim of professional development. It emphasizes the aim of professional development, which is the cultivation of morality of a government official. And all the design of the system is to cultivate morality. In other words, it sets the very clear tone on the government's attitude towards moral education. And this sends a very clear signal to the general public as what is most valued, right? Now, the second function is to select the most virtuous person for the position of the leader. And it goes hand in hand with the first function. Regarding the selection of virtuous candidate, we'll have a specific lecture on this topic in the future, okay? In this course, but the different lecture. But, surely a system like this can only be designed by virtuous lawmakers themselves, right? As we have mentioned before. Now, lastly, I think I will mention very briefly just why we need to select a virtuous leader. Remember, on the surface, okay, an action of a virtuous leader is not necessarily or always in line with the people's wish. Not necessarily. A leader who simply fulfills people's wish in an indiscriminate fashion is not necessarily doing his job properly or her job. Sometimes he or she must make tough decisions, which will only show merit in the medium to long term. So this is why virtue is incredibly important. In the upcoming lectures, we'll discuss extensively what it means by virtuous leaders and what would a virtuous leader do to manage the country. So to conclude today's lecture, I should like to read a quote from the Governing Principles, Volume 31. It says, "If a leader is unvirtuous, he will bring danger to the nation and chaos to his people. A virtuous leader, on the other hand, will bring stability to the nation and order to his people. The fate of a nation, therefore, lies in the hands of a good ruler who is capable and wise, independent from the changing of seasons." This concludes this lecture. Thank you.